new year, a new fare. On the 2nd of January, millions of people across the country faced a hike in rail prices. Unsurprisingly, commuters at King's Cross were not happy.
Oh, that's pretty disgusting, especially after this upheaval we had in the last week.
Yes, I do believe they're very expensive. It's much cheaper to travel by car.
I'm not sure it's justified given all the chaos that we experienced a few days ago. I think it's a great system. It functions well when it functions well. I guess the only thing I have against it are the costs. So when they go up, it's just yet another sinking feeling in the wallet particularly.
I think it's an absolute disgrace. I think we should take back the rail service and profit from it as passengers instead of having private investors profit in it.
Rising fares, overcrowded trains and delayed services have led to increasing anger over how Britain's railways are run. According to a YouGov survey last year, 60% of the British public support re-nationalising the railways. The main reason cited, that they want the railways to be accountable to taxpayers rather than shareholders. This begs the question, could we see a re-nationalisation of Britain's railways in the future?
And in a way, the railways are victims of their own success. They have attracted a lot of people off the roads, and they have not got sufficient capacity to always deal with that and ensure that people can have seats.
Author and journalist Christian Walmer has written numerous books on the history of Britain's railways. He argues the speed of privatisation has meant the last 20 years have been a bumpy ride.
We had a very rapid stage of privatisation. It was done far too quickly. Between 1992, when the Conservatives surprisingly won the election, and 1997, it was broken up into more than 100 parts, with mainly the rail track then, which was a private company running the infrastructure, 25 train operators, various freight companies and all sorts of ancillary companies supporting that. It's a fragmented industry. And I think we've suffered from that, and I think we are paying more for the railways than we need to if there wasn't a more integrated system, like there is in most countries in Europe.
Since privatisation, passenger numbers have doubled from 750 million in 1995 to 1.5 billion today. But according to one study last year, some train fares have increased by up to 245%. The unions have claimed that under this system, rail fares have become unaffordable.
The promise of privatisation initially was that everything would drive competition and competition would drive fares down. The reality is, since privatisation, the 2 decades we've had it, fares have gone up by 65%. That's over 20% in real terms, and continue to go up by RPI or more every year. And we now have, post-recession, studies that tell us we've got people that have such things as transport poverty, where they're paying 24 and 26% of their gross income to get to or from work and have no choice to do so. And eventually, subsidising the industry by the back door for the privateers to make massive profits while increasing fares is becoming an increasing problem for us.
Whilst the railway infrastructure itself is now back in public hands under Network Rail, the passenger services on the tracks are run by various train operating companies who bid for franchises. One franchise that is in public hands, at least until March, is East Coast. Taken over in November 2009 after National Express was refused further financial support and lost a franchise, it has been hugely successful, bringing in around £1 billion to the exchequer.
Well, the East Coast is a relatively simple franchise because it's not a huge number of trains every day with only quite a limited number of stations, intercity routes, no suburban services. So it's relatively easy to run. It's been a success because it was taken over by the public sector but run by experienced railway people. So it wasn't that much difference from the other franchises, except for the fact that nobody was creaming off a certain percentage to pay the profits of a private company.
The whole franchising process was thrown into doubt in 2012 when the Department for Transport scrapped awarding the West Coast franchise to First Group after significant technical flaws were found in the bidding process. Last year, Green MP Caroline Lucas presented a private member's bill to Parliament, calling for rail operators to be gradually brought back into public hands as franchises expire. But others, such as Ben Southwood at libertarian think tank the Adam Smith Institute, say that re-nationalisation is not necessarily the answer.
The other way of doing it would be having multiple different train companies running on each line. If you could do that safely, which I imagine we could now, rail safety in the UK is the best in Europe at the moment, and I imagine we could do that. But then the alternative is to have regional monopolies who own the track and the rail. That could work just as well, I don't know. That's what we had when rail was most successful in the UK before 1913, so maybe that's the best way. Between 1948 and 1995, the railways were nationalised, and almost no one thinks it was an era of success. The nationalisation thing is a big red herring. We don't just solve the problem by nationalising them, and we might cause new problems.
The railway's fate largely rests on the outcome of the general election. The Conservatives would most likely continue the franchising process, whilst Labour have called for a review. Regardless of the outcome, this is a debate that is unlikely to go away anytime soon. With grand railway projects in the works such as High Speed 2 between London and Birmingham, and Crossrail cutting through the capital, the railway seems set to continue to be of vital importance to the future of Britain's economy, whether in private or public hands.
When it all goes to plan, taking a train can be a relaxing and a pretty pleasant way to travel. But here in the UK, the reality is that it can often become a bit of a nightmare.
Hell, stress.
When it goes wrong, it goes spectacularly wrong.
2017 saw the most train delays in nearly 15 years. And just to add insult to injury, as the service seems to be getting worse, ticket prices just keep going up.
If you're commuting from, let's say, Wokingham to London for work, it's a 32-mile journey which takes just over an hour. A standard year season ticket will cost you over £3,800, but in France, commuting roughly the same distance from Étampes to Paris for 1 year will cost you less than a quarter of that. It doesn't stop there. For the same price as the British season ticket, you can get unlimited train travel anywhere in Germany for a whole year. Members of Parliament have said the UK's rail system is no longer fit for purpose, and a lot of the British public have had enough. In a recent survey, more than half said that they think the current system is a failure. So why are Britain's trains so bad? A lot of people say that one of the main reasons that trains are so rubbish here is because they're privatised, but back in the day, they used to be nationalised. So could returning to the old way of doing things solve the problem? That's what we're going to try and figure out. But first things first.
Understanding the UK train network does require a short history lesson.
In the 19th century, Britain was the world pioneer of train travel. This man, George Stephenson, was known as the father of the railways.
The inventor and engineer built the world's first ever public railway in 1825 in the north of England. 5 years later, he built a railway linking two cities, Liverpool and Manchester.
It paved the way for a revolution. In less than a century, Britain built around 20,000 miles of track across the country. That's nearly enough track to span the entire globe. By 1920, there were about 120 different private rail companies. A year later, the government stepped in and merged the network into 4 regional companies. Then, during the Second World War, as part of the war effort, the Big Four began working together.
The concentration of industrial life on work for the war has continued unceasingly.
And after the war came a new Labour government with some big ideas about how to change British society. They created a universal healthcare and welfare system and nationalised key industries like energy and the railways. On January 1st, 1948, the Big Four became British Rail. The taxpayer owned it, the government controlled it. Nationalising the railway meant making money wasn't so important, providing a good service was. And most importantly, any money British Rail did make was invested back into the railways.
For a while, the trains, the tracks, the buildings, the bridges, everything was completely nationalised. But British Rail lasted less than 50 years.
For the majority of that time, the Conservative Party were in power, and gradually different parts of the service were sold off to private companies. Then, finally in 1994, they started to privatise the trains themselves, essentially ending British Rail for good. Today, pretty much every major rail service is operated by a private company.
So before we start looking at the problems that we have with railways today, we need to make something clear. This isn't an argument about history and whether the old nationalised British Rail is better or worse than what we have today. That kind of comparison just isn't possible. Take the way that train services are monitored. Some of that's changed over time, and there are some historical factors that just don't exist anymore. And you have to remember that privatisation of British Rail happened gradually. It's really important to know the history to understand just how much the system has changed. Comparing trains from the 1950s to 80s to today, it's just not fair and it's just not useful. It's a bit like comparing apples with oranges. So, let's get into why trains are so bad today.
First of all, there's franchising. Now, when the trains were privatised, the government split the railway up into different regions. Private companies can bid to run franchises within these regions, kind of like an auction. The idea is that the government sets the terms of a franchise, a bidding war creates competition, and then the best company should win. But in reality, things don't always work out perfectly, leaving passengers stuck in the middle. Let's take Southern Rail, for example. In 2018, Southern Rail was officially named the worst performing train service in the UK for 3 years in a row.
At least 8% of their trains were either completely cancelled or they were more than half an hour late. Now, when they bid for their franchise back in 2014, they were up against 4 other companies. None of those 4 companies offered exactly what the government wanted, but the government needed somebody to run the line. And even though experts warned that it could cause huge problems, they offered the contract anyway.
That's part of the reason why Southern Service has been plagued by delays and cancellations since. Letting private companies compete to run the trains was meant to allow healthy competition, driving up standards and lowering costs. The situation with Southern shows that the franchise system doesn't always work out. And once a company secures a contract, there's basically no competition. Now, that's not to say private companies can't run good services. If you look at customer satisfaction, the highest ranked operator is Grand Central, a private company, and it's been voted the best value for money operator 6 years in a row. But it's important to point out that Grand Central is a bit of a specialist case. Instead of running a whole franchise, they take slots in the schedule of someone else's, running their own trains on a rival's tracks.
There are a few companies that do it, and supporters of it say that it increases competition between companies. But given that only one train can run on a track at any given time, it's debatable as to how competitive it really is. Either way, companies like Grand Central are rare. Less than 1% of all rail miles travelled by passengers are on trains operated like this. So the franchising system doesn't guarantee healthy competition. And then there's the issue of who runs and operates the trains.
The train companies, like all private businesses, are trying to make money. Take cross-country trains. In 2017, it made £23 million in profit. 20 million of that was paid out in dividends to its shareholders. But critics of the privatised system say this can lead to services suffering. They argue that more money needs to be invested to improve services and to keep ticket prices down.
Trade unions point the finger specifically at profiteering, saying that it can lead to reduced staffing, cost-cutting, safety issues. But businesses obviously disagree with that. They say that they're best placed to run an efficient system.
And as we've already seen, customer satisfaction for private companies can be really high, but then it can also be like Southern's. And on top of that, the government still heavily subsidises Britain's railways by about £5 billion over the last 5 years. Train companies making big profits can be hard for passengers to accept when so much taxpayer money is being put into the railway network.
Then there's the third factor, the tangible physical parts of the British railway network. And in some ways this is the most difficult issue to fix, because replacing failing infrastructure is expensive and it doesn't happen overnight. So York Station was built in the 1870s when Queen Victoria was on the throne. It's a really beautiful example of the unique heritage of British railways, but that is also part of the problem, because a lot of our rail network is really old.
This all looks lovely, I know, but it's also difficult and expensive to upgrade to match modern technology. Lots of trains in Europe run on electric tracks, meaning they can go faster and run efficiently. But only a third of Britain's routes are actually electrified, which ranks us as one of the worst countries in the EU.
So how do we make things better? Is it just a case of making the rail services public again? Maybe, but that won't solve the infrastructure problems that we just spoke about because they're kind of nationalised already. You see, the private companies only actually own the trains themselves, but things like the tracks and the signals, well, they're owned by a separate company called Network Rail.
And Network Rail, well, it's technically owned by the government. Now, okay, this isn't like the old British Rail. The government has less control than it used to, but 60% of train delays in the UK are the responsibility of Network Rail. The point is, even if you nationalise the trains tomorrow, it wouldn't magically fix the problem with signals and tracks. That requires loads of money. And Britain already spends more on the rail network than any other country in Europe. Some say private companies are still the best way to run the railways. They just need more competition. That could mean more companies like Grand Central.
On top of that, they argue that train companies are better placed to know what their customers want, so they should have more say in what trains they run and when.
The Labour Party have made the railways one of their main policy targets.
Privatisation and outsourcing are now a national disaster zone.
Jeremy Corbyn's party are backers of some form of nationalisation and say if they get into government, they'll bring the system into public ownership within 5 years. They say the only way to fix the system is to bring it under centralised control. So if there are problems with the trains like the ones we saw in May 2018, those involved wouldn't just be able to blame each other. Instead, a single organisation would be responsible and could lead to a better service. But not everyone's thrilled with Labour's plan. Critics say that the taxpayer would probably end up paying the price for the nationalisation. And there are plenty of people who will wistfully tell you that things were worse back in the days of British Rail. But as we said earlier, it's not as simple as comparing then and now.
But there is one modern example of nationalisation that actually could prove useful, and that's East Coast, the line that this train is running on right now.
Between 2007 and 2009, it was run by National Express, but they got into financial trouble and the government stepped in and took control.
Under public ownership, customer satisfaction rose, and it brought in nearly £250 million, so it was widely viewed as a huge success.
It was then put into private hands in 2015, but it hit further financial problems and was taken back under government control again.
We can't know if nationalising all the train companies would be a success, just like we can't know if other forms of privatisation would be a success either. And whether private or national, companies are still reliant on the same ageing infrastructure, but they're not actually responsible for maintaining it. There's definitely no simple fix. But Parliament and the public agree that the system is broken and that it might be time to try something different.
Rail nationalisation, or re-nationalisation I should say, is finally here. South Western Railway is the first train operator to be nationalised as part of the government's transition to Great British Railways. Most train operators, or those with Department for Transport contracts, will be brought under public ownership. So is this a good move? And what does it mean for commuters across the country? Well, to talk more about this, I'm now joined by transport expert Christian Wolmar. Christian, let me start by asking that question. Is this a good move?
I think it is a good move because the railways always sat rather uncomfortably as a entirely commercial private operation. Essentially, they're a social good. In other words, they're something that we all need and is an important part of our infrastructure. And that means that they could never go bust. So if you then privatise them, you're giving companies the chance to make lots of profits, but if they then get into trouble, then they just hand the keys back. And that happened several times over the last 30 years that there has been this franchise network. So bringing them back in-house, I think, is a logical step.
Some, though, will worry, won't they? Because they may remember the times when all the trains were nationalised and services weren't quite up to what consumers and commuters were expecting. What would you say to those who do remember those times and who fear this move?
Well, you're obviously too young to remember those times. And actually, the truth of the matter is that British Rail, in its last 5 to 10 years, was a very effective organisation which managed to make improvements to the railways much more cheaply than under privatisation. It had a great kind of advertising campaign with letting the trains take the strain and all that kind of thing. It was actually an effective organisation. And so hopefully Great British Railways will reclaim some of that and become an equally effective organisation. Of course, it had faults, but then, as any train traveller over the last 30 years knows, so did the private system.
And why do you think we have got to this point? I mean, obviously, we had a Labour government elected, which supports nationalisation much more than a Conservative government. But why do we get to this point that private companies just weren't or were viewed as unable to continue running these franchises?
Well, interestingly, if this process to create Great British Railways started under the Tories in 2018, when there was a chaos as a result of timetable changes that hadn't been properly thought through. And they spent several years working on this and actually produced a model of it, which is not quite the one that's been adopted by the Labour Party. So in a way, I'm sure they will jump on this and start criticising him, but it was their idea. They recognise that the railways are inherently better in the public sector because they are an essential part of our infrastructure, and therefore they can't really be properly privatised.
So if somebody is travelling on South Western Railway from Sunday, what difference will they actually notice?
Well, probably not a lot, or anything indeed. They will, but over time, the railways should become more efficient. They should save quite a lot of money in all the costs that have been incurred under the fragmented system of consultants and lawyers and all the stuff and disputes between various players. And also, it should be easier for Great British Railways, the government, to actually determine where investment should go, what decisions should be made over timetables, do all these things in a much cheaper, easier and more efficient way. But it will take some time to thread through.
One thing you didn't mention there, though, was ticket prices. Do you think we'll see those drop?
You won't see them drop, that's for sure. But I think there'll be a lot of pressure on the government, which sees this policy as very important, not to push up rail fares, particularly given that they've frozen fuel duty. So I suspect that they will try to avoid putting the prices up, the fares up by very much at all over the next few years, because they see this as an important policy area for them, and they want to make a success of it.
You mentioned also that this allows more chance for kind of coordination across the country. Does that also apply to rail infrastructure, to improving the tracks and the actual rail infrastructure we have in the UK?
Absolutely. One of the points about rail privatisation that was problematic was that you had to pay. If you were a train operator, you had to you got compensation when the tracks were being repaired. So it would cost more to repair the tracks because you had to compensate these train operators, despite the fact that you were doing work which would make their services better. And it was those sort of stupid anomalies which is so important to get rid of. And that will make working on the railways, doing enhancements, renewing track and all that more efficient and easier to carry out.
So now we're in this process. As I mentioned earlier, we're expecting it to wrap up by the end of 2027. If you were going a year on from there, say, what would be a kind of checklist for you of signs of success of nationalisation?
Well, I'd like to see a coherent Great British Railways making decisions that were in the interest of passengers, working out where best to spend what's always a limited amount of money, and running an efficient, safe network. And if it passes that test, then people will quickly forget this era of privatisation and recognise that, the railways are better run in an integrated way by a commercially minded Great British Railways. So it will both provide kind of commercial services where sometimes the railway is profitable, and social services where, branch lines where you're never going to make a profit, but they're very important for local communities. So that's the whole view, taking a holistic view of this very important industry.
Is there a risk for the government here, though? Because commuters who are dissatisfied by their services would have once been able to blame private companies. Now the blame will be directly with the government, with the Transport Secretary.
Well, what's funny about privatisation, one of the failures of privatisation was that the government at the time, the Tories of the 1990s, hoped that by privatising the railways, they would get ministers off the hook when things went wrong. And in fact, actually, if we remember some of the things that did go wrong, and you'd end up with ministers like Chris Grayling being called failing Grayling because he was seen as being responsible for the railways, even though they were privatised. So governments can never get out of the fact that the railways are an inherent part of the way the country runs, and they will always be held responsible for them.
And obviously this is not the first franchise to be nationalised. We've already seen a number of franchises coming into government hands. What has the experience been there?
Well, the difference is that the franchises that have been taken over, there have been 4 of them, have been distressed kind of takeovers. So they haven't been operated very well, or they've fallen into financial difficulties or the like, and they've been taken in-house, as it were. The difference now is that South West Trains and some of the other franchises that are going to be taken over in forthcoming months are actually quite well run, and they're kind of reasonably stable organizations, and therefore it will be much easier for the government agency, Great British Railways, to run them and continue making progress with them. So these are not distressed purchases, as it were. They're just kind of takeovers of reasonably functioning organizations, but still they'll be able to save money because it will no longer be fragmented between all the different bits of the railway.
And are these purchases, is the taxpayers' money going towards these privatised companies to take over the franchises, or is it simply an end of a contract?
It's simply an end of a contract, and that's an important point. There's no cost to this because they decided quite rightly that breaking the contracts would lead to all sorts of legal problems and issues. So instead, they're merely taking over contracts that have run out.
And let me just ask you finally, if you had a crystal ball, would you think 30 years down the line we may see a desire again for privatisation, or do you think this nationalisation will stick?
No, I think this will, be the structure for quite a long time, because the privatisation experiment didn't really work. Railtrack was also privatised, which is now Network Rail, and that was taken back in-house because it essentially collapsed in the 2000s. And I can't see that any government would want to start breaking up the railways again. There's lots of other problems to deal with that are far more pressing.
Christian Wormar, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.